When I heard scratching at the door that winter night, I thought it was the wind. When I opened it, I saw something that would change my life forever. An adult lynx with a dead cub in its mouth, standing on my doorstep. His yellow eyes were begging for help, and I had mere seconds to make a decision. Slam the door on the wild predator or let him inside. What happened next went beyond what I thought was possible between man and a wild animal. I lived alone in a forest hut, 50 kilometers from the nearest city. I chose solitude, escaped from the hustle and bustle of the world. But that night, the loneliness ended. That night, I understood that a mother's love knows no boundaries, neither species nor instinct. The lynx who came to me for help taught me more about courage and trust than any human. And I, unknowingly, became part of something much bigger, an operation that would save hundreds of animals and put an end to a network of poachers that had been terrorizing the forest for months. It had been snowing non-stop for 3 days now. The snowstorm came suddenly, as it does in the mountains at the end of December, turning the world outside the window into a swirling white wall. The temperature dropped below -20 degrees, and the wind howled so loudly that it sometimes woke me up in the middle of the night. I was sitting by the fireplace, reading an old book by the light of a kerosene lamp, when the electricity failed on the second day of the storm. I got used to living in the forest. It's been 5 years since I moved into this cottage after my divorce and loss of my corporate job. I sold my apartment in the city, bought this little wooden house on the edge of a nature reserve, and decided to live a simpler life. I worked as a freelance writer, which allowed me to stay home and enjoy the silence. Silence was what I needed most. But that night, the silence was brutally broken. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening when I heard scratching. At first I thought it was branches hitting the door, blown by the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. Then I heard something else, a low, almost wailing sound I had never heard before. My body immediately tensed. I have lived in the forest long enough to know its inhabitants. I saw deer, foxes, wild boars, and once even a bear wandering through my property in early spring. But none of these animals ever came near my house. Wild animals avoid people. This is a basic rule of survival. So why was there something scratching at my door in the middle of the worst snowstorm in years? I stood up slowly, my heart beating faster and faster. I went to the door and stopped, listening. The scratching intensified, almost desperate. I swallowed and slowly opened the door a few centimeters. What I saw made my blood run cold. An adult lynx stood on the doorstep, its thick, grey-brown fur covered with snow and ice. In its mouth it was holding a tiny baby lynx which was hanging limply. The animal looked at me with yellow eyes that held a desperation so human, so pure, that it took my breath away. My first impulse was simple and primal. I slammed the door and jumped back. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding. A lynx is not a domestic cat. It is a wild predator with sharp claws and teeth, an animal that can kill a deer. And now he stood before me, separated only by a wooden door. But the scratching didn't stop. On the contrary, it became even more insistent, almost panicky, and then it dawned on me that this sound didn't sound like aggression, it sounded like a plea. I stood with my head against the door, listening to the scratching and feeling every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, safe and warm. But there was something about that sound that bothered me. Desperation. Helplessness. This wasn't the behavior of a predator hunting its prey. It was the behavior of someone begging for help. Slowly, with a trembling hand, I opened the door again, wider this time. The lynx was still standing in the same place. He didn't try to lunge. He didn't growl. He just stood there with the cub in his mouth and looked at me with those incredible eyes. Steam rose from his nostrils with each breath. I saw his sides heaving. He was exhausted. I took a step back, making room. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the lynx slowly and carefully went inside. I closed the door behind him, blocking out the howling wind and snow. The warmth from the fireplace immediately enveloped us both. The lynx went straight to the fireplace, gently placed the cub on the carpet and turned to me as if waiting. There was a smell in the air, wet fur, pine needles, and something else. Something metallic. Blood. I approached slowly, my hands still shaking. The young lynx lay still, its small sides barely moving. I went to the kitchen, filled a bowl with water, and set it a few meters from the lynx. The animal approached cautiously, keeping its eyes on me, and began to drink greedily. While he was drinking, I brought a piece of meat from the fridge, cut it and put it on a plate. The lynx sniffed them and began to eat them, but not because of the hunger of a wild animal, slowly, as if each bite required enormous effort. Something was wrong. I sat down next to the young man. It was tiny, no more than 2 or 3 weeks old. His eyes were half closed, his body was barely moving. I touched it gently. It was icy and almost unresponsive to touch. Panic seized me by the throat. This little one was dying. I took an old blanket, wrapped the baby lynx in it and placed it near the fireplace. The mother immediately approached the cub, lay down next to it, and started licking it, trying to warm it up. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. A savage mother desperately fighting for her child's life. I added wood to the fireplace and then noticed a small dark puddle on the floor. Blood. I quickly turned to the lynx. One of her front legs was stretched out at an odd angle, the fur around it clotted with blood. I slowly approached. The lynx let out a low, warning growl, but I spoke to it in a calm, reassuring voice. I knelt down and held out my hand for him to smell me. The animal sniffed. Its purring stopped, and I carefully moved my fingers to its injured paw. What I saw made my stomach tighten. A deep, jagged wound, skin torn, muscle damaged, edges torn with characteristic parallel cuts. I have lived in the forest long enough to recognize such a wound. It was a trap. The lynx fell into the trap, but somehow freed itself, overcoming the pain, leaving pieces of meat in the metal jaws. The wound wasn't fresh, at least a day or 2 old, and the tissues around it were already inflamed. The whole thing started to sink in. With that paw, she couldn't hunt or find food, and her cub was slowly dying of hunger and cold. In desperation, she came to me, to man, her natural enemy. I quickly ran to the bathroom for the first aid kit. The nearest town was 50 kilometers away, so I always had a supply of medicine. I took the disinfectant, bandages and antibiotic ointment and returned to the lynx. The animal looked at me understandingly, as if it sensed that I wanted to help. I knelt down next to her, showed her the bottle of disinfectant, let her smell it, and carefully started dressing the wound. The lynx flinched as the liquid touched the injured area, and I heard it growl between its teeth, but it didn't withdraw its paw or try to bite me. The wild animal endured the pain because it instinctively understood that I was trying to help. This moment, this wild, powerful creature allowing me, a human, to touch its wound, was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I cleaned the wound, applied antibiotic ointment, and bandaged the paw. When I finished, the lynx reached out its paw and licked my hand with its rough tongue, a gesture of trust I will never forget. It was like a seal between us, a silent understanding across the species barrier. Now it's time for the young ones. It was severely dehydrated and malnourished. It urgently needed fluids. I dissolved milk powder in warm water, added some honey, and found an old dropper. The lynx was watching me, and when I carefully picked up the cub, she didn't growl, she just came closer. The baby was so weak he couldn't even nurse. The fluid just ran down his face. I remembered a local vet who once explained how to feed weak kittens. Massage the throat to stimulate the swallowing reflex, then give the milk very slowly, drop by drop. Gradually, the cub began to swallow poorly. I spent several hours holding him in a blanket, massaging his little throat and giving him milk. Ricioa was lying next to me, resting her head on my knee. In that moment, I felt like part of something bigger, a family, even if it was an interspecies family. Around 3 a.m., the baby lynx started moving its paws more actively, its breathing became more regular, and when I gave it milk again, it even weakly tried to suck on the dropper. At dawn, the baby visibly stood up, opened its eyes and made a soft squeak. Ricioa reacted immediately, licking them with new energy. I leaned against the wall, tired but relieved that the cub had survived. For the first time that night, the lynx allowed herself to relax and close her eyes. But as I rested, my mind returned to the wound. Parallel cuts, depth, everything pointed to a trap. but trapping has been banned in this forest for many years. If anyone set traps, it was poachers, which posed a serious threat not only to animals but also to tourists. I decided to follow the lynx's trail and confirm my suspicions. I looked out the window. The snowstorm was already weakening. Lynx and her cubs were sleeping by the fireplace. I dressed warmly, took my radio and a long pole to check the snow in front of me, and headed out. The tracks were partially covered with snow, but still visible. I walked slowly, carefully checking the area in front of me with my stick so as not to fall into the trap myself. After about a kilometer, I reached a small clearing, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. There were metal traps at the edge of the clearing, at least 5 in a small space. Rage boiled within me. These traps were deadly. They could kill lynxes, wolves, and even bears. Moreover, they could maim an innocent traveler. I took a few more steps, checking every meter with the stick, when suddenly the stick sank into the snow. Another trap, carefully hidden among the pine branches. I jumped back, my heart racing. I had to act immediately. I took out the radio and contacted the forest guard. They responded almost immediately. I quickly explained the situation. A lynx with a trap wound, a whole series of illegal traps in the forest, a threat to everyone. The forest guard replied that they would leave immediately and asked me not to touch the traps. I recorded the coordinates on my GPS and carefully made my way back to the cabin. When I returned, the lynx greeted me at the door, clearly concerned about my absence. A young lynx was jumping nearby, feeling much better. The pain in my chest has eased a bit. This little one will live. An hour later, the guards arrived, 3 men in Forest Service uniforms. I briefly explained what happened and pointed out the window at the lynx. The head ranger nodded and said that they had received several reports of injured animals over the past 6 months, but they couldn't find the cause. I led the guards to a clearing with traps. When they saw them, their faces became serious. The head guard crouched next to one of the traps and stated that it was professional equipment. They began searching the area and found more traps and small cuts in the trees, poachers' markings used for orientation. It was an entire poaching network, carefully planned and organized. The head guard asked me to go back home and keep an eye on the lynx. Her wound was direct evidence against the poachers. We had to photograph the injuries. At home, I carefully removed the bandages and took some sharp photos from different angles. Ricioer allowed me to repeat it patiently. I sent photos to the guard, and he replied that the wound perfectly matched the traps he found. For the next 2 days, guards combed the forest. They found about 20 traps placed along game trails and discovered a makeshift poachers' camp with animal skins. Since the criminals checked their traps regularly, the guards set an ambush for them. In the meantime, the lynx and her cubs lived in my house. I continued to feed the cub, and by the 3rd day it was drinking on its own. Lynx was recovering, the wound was healing, and she could now lean on her paw without pain. I watched as the lynx cub became more and more active, playing with its mother and catching her tail. The wild animals trusted me enough to behave completely naturally in my presence. It was amazing to be a part of their world, even for a short time. On the 4th night, the guards reported that the ambush had been a success. The poachers, 2 men in an old pickup truck, came to check the traps and were arrested. More traps and flaying tools were found in their vehicle. The chief guard came to me personally, and when he saw the lynx lying calmly by the fireplace and the cub playing with a string, he shook his head and said that in 30 years of service, he had never seen anything like it. During interrogation, the poachers admitted to setting dozens of traps. Thanks to the lynx that led me to the traps, this criminal activity was stopped. The ranger thanked me and told me that all the traps had been removed from the forest and the poachers would be prosecuted. It's been 3 weeks since the lynx knocked on my door that night. The wound on her paw had completely healed, leaving only a small scar. The cub has grown into an active, curious child, now weighing almost twice as much as he did then. I knew it was time to release them back into the forest. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew it was the right one. I chose a warm, sunny day when the snow was starting to melt and the smell of spring was in the air. I opened the door wide and stepped aside. Lynx got up, looked at the open door, then at me, and finally at the cub. The little one began to stomp restlessly on the threshold, sniffing the fresh air. Slowly, the lynx approached me, and I knelt down. She came very close and touched my hand with her nose. A cool, moist, incredibly gentle touch. This moment only lasted a few seconds, but I will remember it forever. It was as if the lynx was thanking me, saying goodbye and showing that she remembered me. Then she walked away, nudged the cubs with her nose, and they went to the door. The baby tried to imitate its mother's gesture and clumsily nudged my hand with its muzzle. It was so moving that it took my breath away. They went out onto the porch. The lynx looked back one last time, and they disappeared into the forest. I stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the tracks in the melting snow. Part of me wanted to call them back, but I knew they were where they belonged. The forest was safe again, and they had a chance to live a normal life as wild animals. 6 months have passed. It was already late autumn, and I was walking in the forest. I was walking along a familiar path when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. In the distance, about 50 meters, 2 lynxes were standing in a small clearing. One was an adult, with characteristic tufts on his ears. The other was young, already clearly grown. They drank water from the stream. The older lynx raised its head, sensing my presence, and looked straight at me. We stared at each other for several long seconds, and I was almost sure I recognized him. Something about those yellow eyes was incredibly familiar. The young lynx also raised its head, and I saw how much it had grown, how strong it had become. I didn't move, I just stood there, feeling my heart fill with warmth. The lynx looked at me for a moment, then turned and disappeared silently into the thicket, the cub behind her. I stayed on the path, smiling through the tears that came to my eyes. They were alive, healthy, together. The baby lynx that I fed drop by drop that winter night grew into a strong young animal. I slowly returned home. That frosty night, the scratching at the door, the yellow eyes full of desperation and hope, it all changed something in me. A mother's love knows no boundaries, neither species nor instinctive. A lynx overcame her fear of humans to save her cubs, and it was the most significant lesson in trust I have ever learned. On that night, we became more than just a human and a wild animal. We became 2 beings connected by the universal language of love, survival, and hope.